The last trace of sunset had vanished behind the low hills of rural Texas as Ethan Miller guided his silver sedan along the winding Tulane Road. The hum of the engine was steady, broken only by the rhythmic thump of tires passing over slight imperfections in the asphalt. Darkness wrapped itself around the landscape like a heavy curtain, and aside from the occasional glint of a reflector or the distant glow of a farmhouse window, the world outside his headlights was swallowed whole. He was alone on the road, not another vehicle in sight for miles. It was a quiet kind of night, the kind that whispered of long thoughts and solitary reflection. Ethan glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 9 o'clock in the evening. He'd left his grandmother's house later than intended. She had insisted on one more slice of pecan pie, one more story about her garden, one more reminder to drive safely. Her voice echoed in his mind now, warm and tender, as the miles rolled by beneath him. At 22 years old, Ethan had every reason to feel proud. He was the first in his family to attend a major university, full scholarship, double major in history and political science, with his eyes set on law school after graduation. He had worked for everything he had, earning every grade, every opportunity, every small success. Tonight had been a rare break from the academic whirlwind, a visit to his grandmother who lived in a tiny rural town tucked far from the hustle of university life. The road ahead stretched endlessly in front of him. He turned the music down and opened the window slightly. A breeze slipped inside, carrying with it the scent of warm earth and wild grass. Despite the darkness, he felt strangely peaceful. That is, until he saw the red and blue lights. They appeared in his rearview mirror like a sudden storm, bright, unmistakable, and approaching fast. For a second, Ethan's heart stuttered in confusion. There was no one else on the road. He looked at his speedometer, 53 miles per hour. The limit was 55. He wasn't swerving, wasn't on his phone, wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, the lights drew closer and the wail of the siren pierced the night. He swallowed hard and blinked, his fingers tightening instinctively around the steering wheel. The flashing lights filled his rear view, reflecting off the mirror, the dashboard, the windows. There was no mistaking the signal now. Pull over. Ethan blinked again and guided the car to the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires as he came to a slow stop beneath a skeletal-looking tree. The siren died, but the lights remained, casting a surreal glow over the quiet stretch of road. His heartbeat was faster now, thudding against his chest in a way that made his shirt feel too tight. He turned off the engine, rolled down the window fully, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as his parents had taught him, just as every young black man in America was taught. Hands visible, movement slow, voice respectful. He took a breath. In the side mirror, he watched the silhouette of the officer emerge from the vehicle. The patrol car's headlights lit him from behind, obscuring his features, casting a long shadow that stretched toward Ethan's car. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder with each step. The officer stopped just behind the driver's side window. Ethan resisted the urge to turn his head fully. He kept his hands on the wheel. Evening, the officer said, his tone curt, almost perfunctory. License and registration, please. Ethan nodded. Yes, sir. My license is in my wallet, front right pocket. Registration's in the glove compartment. A pause. You can go ahead. Moving slowly, Ethan retrieved his wallet and handed over his license, then leaned to the right, opening the glove box and producing the registration form. The officer took them both without a word and stepped back toward the patrol car. The silence returned, but this time it was charged, like a taut wire humming with invisible tension. Ethan glanced at the mirror again. The officer stood by his vehicle, head bent slightly, the papers in hand, illuminated by the dome light inside the patrol car. It was a quiet stretch of highway, and no other vehicles passed. Just a whisper of wind and the occasional chirp of night insects filled the air. Minutes passed, longer than seemed necessary. A strange unease began to settle in Ethan's chest, tightening like a coil. Was something wrong with his license? Had his name been flagged for some reason? He had no criminal record, no unpaid tickets, not even a warning. But the officer remained still, staring at the document in his hand, as if reading something strange. Ethan shifted in his seat. Another minute. Still no movement. Then, at last, the officer began walking back. There was something different about his posture now, a hesitancy in his stride, a flicker of uncertainty in the way his boots touched the ground. He came to a stop by the window again. But this time, he didn't immediately speak. Instead, he held the license in both hands, eyes fixed on the name printed across the top. Ethan Miller. The officer said slowly, as if testing the words aloud. His voice had dropped an octave, softened by something Ethan couldn't yet name. You said you were visiting family? Ethan nodded. My grandmother. She lives in Harmony Ridge, just past County Line Road. The officer didn't respond right away. He looked again at the license, his expression unreadable in the shadows. Then he asked quietly, Your grandfather wouldn't happen to be Sergeant Jonathan Miller, would he? Ethan blinked. The question caught him completely off guard. Yes, sir, he said cautiously. That was my grandfather. The officer's hand lowered slowly, still holding the license, but now his gaze wasn't suspicious. It was distant, haunted, even. Something had changed, and Ethan could feel it. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. Ethan's fingers were still resting on the steering wheel, knuckles pale from how firmly he gripped it. His pulse thudded in his ears as he studied the officer's face, trying to read it, to understand the sudden shift in energy. The man's features, now more visible in the beams of his own headlights, had lost their earlier stiffness. The suspicious crease between his brows had softened, but it wasn't replaced by friendliness. It was something heavier, something uncertain. The officer held Ethan's license like it was no longer just a plastic card, but key to a door he hadn't expected to open tonight. He seemed unable to look away from the name printed at the top, even though he'd already confirmed it once aloud. The tension in his jaw pulsed visibly. His breath had slowed. Something was happening behind his eyes. Memories, calculations, doubts, all spinning silently while Ethan sat in rigid stillness, waiting for the next move. When the officer finally spoke again, his voice had lost its commanding edge. It was quieter, as if he had suddenly remembered they were not standing in a place of war, but on the side of a deserted country road in Texas. Stay here, he said, not unkindly, but without any further explanation. He took a step back, turned, and returned to his patrol car, still carrying Ethan's license and registration. Ethan exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, the breath shaky as it left him. He leaned slightly to the side, watching the man disappear into the patrol vehicle. The door closed. The lights still flashed. The silence resumed. Inside the car, Ethan remained motionless. He didn't check his phone. He didn't turn the engine back on. He just sat, alert, unsure whether he was still a suspect or something else entirely. He tried to remember the last time he'd heard his grandfather's name spoken by someone outside the family. It had been years, maybe even since a funeral. His grandfather's memory had been preserved mostly in framed black and white photos and the quiet reverence of family gatherings. But now here, it had become something alive, something that clearly meant more to the stranger than Ethan could yet understand. After a long pause, the door of the patrol car opened again. The officer emerged slower this time, walking with a deliberateness that suggested he was still sorting out what to do. His flashlight was off. He approached Ethan's window with less rigidity than before, but with a seriousness that hadn't lessened. When he arrived, he crouched slightly to meet Ethan's eye level. I'm going to be honest with you, he began, voice low. When I pulled you over, I thought you fit a profile. The way your car moved near the curve. There's been some trouble out here lately. Stolen vehicles, kids drag racing, drug runners using these back roads. I thought you might be part of that, but... He stopped himself, as if the rest were too difficult to explain cleanly. He turned the license over in his hand again, the faintest edge of conflict still lingering in his features. His eyes, though, had changed. They no longer scanned Ethan with suspicion, but with recognition of something deeper. I served, he continued, almost reluctantly. U.S. Army, infantry, 2 tours in Iraq. Lost a lot of good men. Almost didn't make it out myself. Ethan nodded once, unsure where the story was going, but sensing its gravity. The officer wasn't just talking to fill the space. I was in Fallujah, the man said, back in '05. I was hit during an ambush. Fragmentation wounds to the chest and legs. I was bleeding out behind a crumbling wall in an alley, and the rest of my unit had pulled back. I was alone, thinking it was over. The words came slowly, weighed down by memory. But then, someone dragged me out, under fire, carried me half a block to where the medevac team could reach us. He had no reason to risk himself for me. We barely knew each other, but he did it anyway. His eyes met Ethan's, and the weight of what he was about to say made his voice falter for the first time. That man was your grandfather. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't tense or uncertain. It was reverent, as though both of them were standing at the edge of something sacred. Ethan blinked, stunned. His throat tightened, and he didn't know what to say. He had known his grandfather serve, had heard vague stories about his time overseas, but the details had been sparse, softened by time and his family's tendency to protect each other from painful memories. This image of his grandfather running through gunfire to save a fellow soldier was something new, something powerful. He was tough as hell, the officer said, a faint smile breaking the somber expression. No hesitation, no fear, just focus. That kind of man sticks with you. I owed him my life. The words carried no exaggeration. They landed with the finality of truth. Ethan felt a strange mixture of pride and grief swell in his chest. Pride in the kind of man his grandfather had been. Grief that he never really got to ask him about it. To understand a man beyond the soft-spoken veteran who gave him pocket knives and taught him how to fish. The officer straightened up and looked at the license one last time before handing it back. "I'm sorry I approached you the way I did," he said. "That wasn't about you. That was about the world I've seen and the things I've learned to expect from it. But I was wrong tonight. You didn't deserve that." Ethan accepted the card and papers quietly, nodding in acknowledgement. The apology felt sincere. And strangely, despite the tension earlier, he no longer felt anger or fear, just a surreal awareness that this night had become something far more complicated than a routine traffic stop. "You said his name, and it just hit me," the officer continued. "You don't forget a name like Miller when it's tied to something that saves your life. I don't know what he told you about his service, but I owe everything I have to that man, including the chance to come home." Ethan's voice finally returned, low but steady. "He never told us much. I knew he served, but not that. He wouldn't have. Men like him don't brag. They carry the weight quietly." There was another long pause. The flashing lights in the patrol car had begun to feel like a strange backdrop to a moment that had shifted into something deeply personal. "I'm Officer Harris," the man said, extending his hand now for the first time as a person, not a uniform. "And I just want to say thank you for being here, for reminding me of who your grandfather was." Ethan shook his hand, unsure what else to say. But in that handshake, something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, and the quiet bond of a legacy that had unexpectedly come full circle. And though the night was still dark around them, something had undeniably changed. For a moment, Ethan didn't know whether to drive away or stay seated. Officer Harris had stepped back toward his patrol car, not out of procedure this time, but to give the young man space to process what had just unfolded between them. The scene, bathed in the rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights, now seemed suspended in time. Ethan wasn't sure how long he sat there, fingers slack around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, heart still recovering from the emotional weight of the revelation. It wasn't a story that unsettled him. It was a sudden understanding of how little he truly knew about the man whose name he carried. Jonathan Miller had always been quiet, not cold, not distant, but reserved in a way that made it easy to mistake humility for secrecy. He had never told war stories at the dinner table. He never kept medals out on display, or wore his service proudly on his sleeve. Ethan had grown up with fragments, an old photo and uniform tucked in a drawer, the careful way his grandfather folded the American flag when he helped raise it in the local park, the occasional stiffness in his walk during colder months. But never this. Never the part where he'd risked everything to save another man. When Harris returned to his car, he didn't start the engine. Instead, He leaned against the hood with arms folded, gaze lifted toward the stars above the tree line. There was a stillness to him now that hadn't been there before. Less like a police officer on duty, and more like a soldier remembering ghosts. Ethan stepped out of his car slowly, the night air cooler than before. Gravel shifted beneath his shoes as he crossed a few steps between them. "I didn't know any of that," Ethan said quietly. Harris didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was gentler than it had been all night. "You weren't supposed to. That's just how men like him lived, with silence, not spotlights." Ethan nodded slowly. "We only ever heard bits and pieces. My dad said he wouldn't talk about the war, not even when asked." "That tracks," Harris replied, glancing toward him. "Some of the strongest men I ever met were the ones who never spoke a word about what they went through. It wasn't shame. It wasn't trauma. It was a kind of sacred silence, like speaking out loud would somehow make it smaller." Ethan leaned back slightly, folding his arms. The silence that followed was not tense, but reflective. There was a solemnity in the air now, a shared understanding that neither of them had expected when the lights first flashed on that lonely stretch of road. "What happened to him?" Harris asked after a while. "If you don't mind me asking." "He passed a few years ago," Ethan replied, voice low. "Stroke. It was quick. He was home with my grandmother when it happened." Harris nodded once. Slowly, the weight of that information settling over him. "I wish I'd gotten a chance to see him again, to thank him properly. I think he would have said you already did, just by making it home." For the first time, Harris allowed a brief smile. It was tight, restrained, but honest. He looked out over the darkened hills again, eyes narrowed, as if trying to see beyond the trees, into the past. After a few more seconds, he stepped away from the hood and motioned toward Ethan's car. "You're free to go," he said. "I'm not writing you up for anything. You were doing everything right. Tonight was strange, and then it got personal." Ethan nodded, but he didn't move toward the car. He hesitated. "Can I ask something?" he said. "Of course." "When you saw my name, what exactly made you react that way? Was it just a memory, or was there something else?" Harris considered that carefully. He didn't answer right away. Then he shifted his weight, arms folding again as he leaned against the car. "You know, when I was lying there, bleeding out, I wasn't thinking about surviving. I wasn't praying or begging or even scared. I was resigned. But when your grandfather showed up, when he grabbed me, lifted me, dragged me through that chaos, it wasn't just that he saved my life. It was the way he did it. Calm, precise, like he'd already decided I wasn't going to die. And that was that." Ethan listened closely, feeling something swell in his chest. "Years later," Harris continued, "I tried to track him down, wrote a letter, but never got a response. I figured maybe he didn't want to relive it. I respected that. But seeing your name tonight, it was like the past punched through the present. For a split second, it wasn't just a traffic stop. It was like I'd been given a second chance to say thank you. Through you." Ethan nodded slowly, the depth of that admission not lost on him. "Do you know if he got the letter?" Harris asked. Ethan thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't think so. Or, if he did, he never mentioned it. But he kept a lot to himself. It wouldn't surprise me if he read it and just didn't know how to respond." Harris gave another small nod, as if that, too, fit perfectly with the man he remembered. "You know," he said, "I've met a lot of people on this job. Most of them forget your name the second you walk away. But your grandfather, I never forgot his. I never will." Ethan stepped back toward his car, but not before offering one final glance. "Thank you, Officer Harris." "No," Harris said. "Thank you. And tell your family. Tell them he wasn't just a good soldier. He was the kind of man other soldiers remember decades later." Ethan opened the door and sat behind the wheel once more. As he pulled away, the lights behind him finally faded, and the road stretched out ahead, empty and dark. But something had changed. The weight of his grandfather's name was no longer just a piece of family history. It was legacy, living, breathing, undeniable. And now, more than ever, he felt the responsibility of carrying it forward. The hum of the engine became a quiet companion as Ethan drove back onto the open road, his thoughts heavier than they'd ever been after a visit to his grandmother's house. The night had not changed. Still as still, the stars overhead as sharp as before, but inside him, something had shifted permanently. His grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly as the adrenaline of the encounter wore off, but the emotional residue clung to his chest like damp clothes after a storm. It wasn't just the shock of the situation, or the strange comfort he felt after learning what his grandfather had done. It was a sudden sense of incompleteness. Like someone had handed him the final page of a story he never realized he'd only known the beginning of. Several minutes passed before he reached a rest stop. A small turnout with a picnic table and a single lamp casting a dim pool of light onto the concrete. He pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence that followed. The echo of Officer Harris's words still played in his mind. Calm, precise, like he'd already decided I wasn't going to die, and that was that. The image of his grandfather, firm-jawed, modest, always ready with a quiet nod or a slow smile, now existed in two layers. The man Ethan remembered and the man others had owed their lives to. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old notebook he used for class notes and quiet thoughts. Tonight, he flipped to a clean page and just stared at it, pen poised but unmoving. What did you write when the past reached through decades to tap your shoulder in the dark? But then a thought occurred to him, something Harris had said, almost in passing. I tried to track him down. Wrote a letter. That detail hadn't left him. What if there were others? Other soldiers, other stories, tucked into forgotten corners, never told because no one thought to ask? His grandfather may have never shared his stories out loud, but they had clearly shaped the lives of people far beyond the small Miller family circle. Ethan suddenly realized how little had ever been documented about his grandfather's time in the military. There were no war medals in the living room, no framed certificates or dog tags on display. Just a single folding flag and a weathered photo of him in uniform beside a fellow soldier whose name had been lost to time. And yet, that man had once written a letter, and that letter might still be somewhere. He pulled out his phone, thumbing quickly through his contact list until he found the number for his father. He hesitated. It was late, almost 10 o'clock at night, but something deeper urged him to press call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice, groggy but alert, answered. Ethan? Everything okay? Yeah, Dad, I'm fine. I had a weird experience on the way back from Grandma's. Can I ask you something? A pause. Sure. What's going on? Ethan took a breath, tried to explain it without letting the emotion in his throat overtake his words. I got pulled over by a cop on the highway. Thought it was going to be something bad, but he recognized Grandpa's name. Said Grandpa saved his life in Iraq. He knew the whole story. Said he even tried to write to him afterward. There was silence on the line. You still there? Ethan asked. Yeah, his father replied, quieter now. I'm just surprised. We didn't know about any of that. He never talked about his service like that, not in detail. Just said he did what he had to and left it at that. Ethan nodded, even though his father couldn't see it. Do you think Grandma might have anything? Letters, journals, anything he kept from those years? Another pause. She might, after he passed. She boxed up a lot of stuff. Said she wasn't ready to go through it. Maybe it's time we ask. Ethan looked out into the empty parking area, the single lamp above him flickering slightly in the wind. He didn't know what he hoped to find, only that there were pieces of his grandfather's life scattered out there, waiting. Pieces that could explain how the quiet man who taught him how to tie knots and fix old radios had also been the reason another man was alive tonight. I think I want to know more, Ethan said finally. I understand. When you come home, we'll go through it together. If he kept anything, it'll be in that box in the attic. They spoke a little longer, but the conversation drifted into a silence that felt more like understanding than absence. After hanging up, Ethan remained seated in the car, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the void beyond the windshield. The road would take him back to campus, back to classes and lectures and the steady rhythm of a life he had carefully built. But now, something had changed. His own story no longer felt entirely his. It was tied, inexplicably, to a man who had quietly carried burdens and responsibilities that no one ever saw. The next day, back on campus, he couldn't stop thinking about the moment Officer Harris had spoken his grandfather's name like it was something sacred. It echoed in his mind during lectures, resurfaced in quiet walks between buildings, filled his thoughts as he lay awake in the early hours. For the first time, history didn't feel like a subject he studied. It felt personal. He made a decision that week, one that began not as an assignment or a project, but as a personal mission to gather the untold story of Sergeant Jonathan Miller, not just through family accounts, but through people whose lives had been touched by him, veterans, fellow soldiers, medics, anyone who had known him in those years. He would start by reaching out to local military forums, veterans associations, and online archives. If Harris had remembered him so vividly, surely others would too. The revelation had not only altered Ethan's perception of his grandfather, it had awakened a hunger to connect, to understand, to honor in a way more tangible than memories alone. And maybe in the process, he'd learn more about the kind of man he wanted to become. Because carrying a name wasn't just about legacy, it was about responsibility. Weeks passed, but the night on the Texas road remained fixed in Ethan's memory, like a bookmark in a novel that had abruptly opened to a chapter he'd never read. Life at the university continued as expected. Lectures, assignments, late-night study sessions. But something beneath the routine had shifted. Ethan found himself returning to that moment again and again. The officer's changed tone, the reverence in his eyes, the way he'd said the name Miller, as if speaking had summoned not just a man, but a monument. After speaking with his father and arranging a weekend visit home, Ethan arrived at the familiar driveway of his childhood house, carrying more than just his backpack. The questions had grown larger. The need for understanding had deepened. As he stepped into the house, the air smelled like old wood, lemon polish, and faint traces of his mother's perfume. His parents welcomed him with warm embraces. But even before they asked how classes were going, his father nodded toward the hallway. "The box is upstairs," he said quietly. "I figured we'd let you look through it first." In the attic, dust hung in the light like frozen rain. The box sat beneath an old tarp, tucked between holiday decorations and forgotten tools. Ethan knelt beside it, brushing away cobwebs before lifting the lid. The smell of paper and aged cloth rose to meet him. Inside were carefully folded uniforms, still bearing the faint green of army fabric, ribbons pinned in rows above the left breast, and a few patches dull by time. Beneath those letters, dozens of them. Some were official-looking, marked with military crests and typed in rigid black ink. Others were handwritten, many yellowed at the edges, written in different hands. A few were addressed to Jonathan Miller, some to Sergeant Miller, and one simply said to the man who carried me out. Ethan unfolded that one first. The handwriting was uneven, like the writer had struggled to hold the pen. The message was short, but every word pulsed with sincerity. "I never got the chance to thank you properly. I think about that alley every time I see my kids. You gave me that chance. I don't have the right words. Just thank you. Wherever you are, whatever you carry, I hope you know you changed more than one life." No name signed, just a date, September 12th, 2008. Ethan sat cross-legged, letter in hand, a lump rising in his throat. He read through others, piecing together fragments of his grandfather's past. A commendation for bravery, a note from a fellow soldier describing how Miller had shielded them during an explosion, even a message from a nurse who remembered how calm he remained under pressure while bleeding from his own wounds. The image that emerged was layered. A man of action, yes, but more than that, a man of principle, of unwavering resolve in the face of chaos. Ethan realized that what Harris had seen that night on the highway wasn't just a name. It was a memory of being seen, being saved, being human in a moment when everything else was falling apart. That Sunday evening, Ethan stood on the porch beside his father, watching the sun dip beneath the tree line. They hadn't spoken much during the day. The silence was comfortable, made fuller by everything Ethan had read. "He never told me," his father said, finally breaking the quiet. "I lived under the same roof, ate dinner with him every night for 18 years, and he never told me he dragged a man through a battlefield." Ethan nodded. I don't think he wanted to be defined by it. Maybe not, but still, I wish I'd known. I wish I'd asked. They fell silent again, the orange light of dusk painting their faces in gold and shadow. Then, slowly, his father turned to him. You think you'll do something with what you found? Ethan exhaled. Yeah, I don't know what yet, but I can't just let it sit in a box. People need to know who he really was. Not for some tribute or attention. Just so he's remembered fully. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. That sounded like something he would have respected. Back at school, Ethan began putting pieces together. He spent evenings cataloging the letters, digitizing old photographs, cross-referencing names from military commendations with online veterans databases. He reached out to forums, emailed regiments, and posted inquiries in digital archives. Slowly, replies trickled in. A man from Ohio who remembered being pinned down in Mosul and described how Sarge Miller had taken point to lead them out. A medic from Kansas who recalled how Miller refused treatment until every injured soldier was on a helicopter. Each account added color, weight, and texture to a legacy that had once seemed invisible. Then came an unexpected message from Officer Harris. It was brief, typed in a simple email, but powerful nonetheless. I've thought about that night every day since. If you ever write something about him, an article, a book, anything, I'd be honored to contribute. People need to remember men like him. Thank you for reminding me who I still have the chance to be. That last sentence struck Ethan like a bell. The ripple of one man's bravery had extended farther than his family ever imagined, shaping not just the lives he'd saved, but the people they'd become afterward. It wasn't just about valor. It was about influence, integrity, and quiet heroism carried like a torch across generations. Months later, Ethan stood before a small gathering at the university's Veterans Symposium. He had been invited to speak, not as a scholar, but as a grandson. His voice was steady, his hands only slightly trembling as he read a passage from one of the letters he had found. My grandfather didn't speak much about the war, he said to the audience, but he spoke through his actions. And those actions echo, not because they were loud, but because they were real, because they saved people, because they mattered. Afterward, several students approached him, some curious, others moved. One veteran, an older man in a pressed navy blazer, shook his hand and said, Your grandfather reminds me of men I served with. Thank you for giving him a voice. As Ethan walked back to his dorm that evening, he carried no papers, no accolades, only a name. The same name on his driver's license, the one that had halted a police officer in his tracks, the one that had carried a man through gunfire, and now, the one that reminded Ethan of who he was, and who he wanted to become. In the quiet of his room, he sat down at his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote only one line at the top of the page. He was a hero, but more than that, he was mine.